Thank you very much, India Design ID. Thank you for having me. So very, very excited to be here. I mean, one of the, sort of general things that we've been playing with and always thinking about in the studio is this idea of relevance. And I think the idea of relevance is kind of very deeply internested with the idea of locating ourselves in time. Like, so how do we see our relationship with the history? How do we see our relationship with the future? Is it intimidating? Is it playful? Is it something that scares us? Is it something that inspires us? And these kind of inquiries are sort of some of the questions that we're constantly juggling in both the research practice, which me and my brother Zamir run together in Goa, as well as the design office in Bombay. We try to critique our own work first before jumping into any other kind of critique. So you'll see a lot of self-bashing in this presentation. So this is just a little deep dive into the idea of relevance. Our kind of portfolio of work over the last, I would say, maybe 15 years or so we began our work in hospitality. Hospitality, obviously, for anyone who's doing hospitality projects in India, my deepest condolences. It's one of the most craziest kind of self-churning kind of fields. And we kind of very, very often occupy ourselves with what's new. This sort of constant question of what is new, where's culture heading. In all these projects, we've had the pleasure and displeasure sometimes of kind of, collaborating with new chefs, new bartenders, new mixologists, new musicians, constantly thinking about where is culture heading, and we've kind of somehow found ourselves in this interesting mix of emergent culture in the country. Maybe on the top right, that's a project we had worked on a while ago called Smokehouse Delhi. I mean, the idea over there was to kind of critique some of what we were seeing around in the really, really high-profile venues. The first one was actually in Delhi. And at that point, I think there was this kind of general understanding that if you didn't spend 5-6 crores on a restaurant, what kind of restaurant is it going to be anyway, right? So to do a serious restaurant, you have to throw serious money, right? So we thought, like, what if we could just take the other extreme and say, let's do something as detailed, as soulful, as interesting, as ornate, as involved, but use like a 250 rupee budget. So basically 25 Reynolds markers at 10 rupees a piece and 35 days of hand drawing. And so we kind of worked on that kind of project. But I think what started happening very often to us as a practice was because we're on this constant treadmill of asking what's new, we kind of stopped asking what's best. This kind of leads us to this idea of the Zeitgeist, which is, it's a lovely word. It sort of means the spirit of the age, right? So if one had to say, think back to what is the spirit of our time, right? And how do we perceive time as a culture today? And these are sort of really, really interesting inquiries. So this was traditionally the role of the artist, right? The role of the artist or the creative professional or the architect is really to kind of capture the spirit of the time, right? Like what are our macro concerns? Like, I mean, we've seen so many presentations over yesterday and today which have sustainability, reuse, recycling, reduce at their heart. And thank you, Boris. This is illuminating presentation in terms of how one can work with these kind of materials that are industrial rejects or industrial kind of detritus, and how do you convert them into objects of beauty. So I think this is really lovely sort of idea of capturing the spirit of our age. And I think in traditional societies, this was the job of the shaman, right? So the shaman would actually, maybe through the help of psychedelics or the help of kind of deep meditative exercises, getting into trances with drumming, they would enter the other realms. They would start spotting movements in herds. They would start seeing where are weather patterns moving, what kind of constellations align when the right berries are ready to be picked. So they were in touch with galactic cycles, much, much longer iterations in time, and they were able to then guide the movement of the tribe, right? So I think in our current conception of creative practitioners, this is then the deeper responsibility of us as an industry to kind of, go back and travel into these other realms, these other time zones, these other kind of time constructs, and try to bring learnings of that into our current understanding of time. And one of the sort of maybe connecting threads in the kind of work that we've been trying to do is to really, it's a very typically Indian word called ungli, right? So basically ungli means finger, and you kind of put your finger in places where it doesn't belong, right? So it's always trying to niggle and wiggle and see what's under the surface and scratch things away a little bit. So if you look at a hunter-gatherer society. We've been, as humans, I mean, all of us in this room, as humanity, have been hunter-gatherers for over 95% of our existence on the planet, right? The industrial age is just 10,000 years ago. We started this journey over 3 million years ago, and the hunter-gatherer lifestyle still exists today. At the bottom, the blue bar actually shows you from the dawn of humanity to the current day. And you have the Sentinelese hunter-gatherers in the Andaman Nicobar, which is in India, which still practice a traditional hunter-gatherer kind of lifestyle. And if you had to diagram what a hunter-gatherer society looks like, the hunter-gatherer societies are usually less than 100 individuals. They organize in discrete tribes. They have a kind of a very anarchic kind of organization. And this is the kind of domain of chiefdoms and the domain of kind of discrete groups which follow kind of weather patterns, migration patterns, and all these groups kind of either collaborate or kind of come together fairly violently in different points of time. So what's interesting is in this kind of conception of when people come together and how people organize as a hunter-gatherer tribe, you are in touch with much, much larger cycles of time. You are, for example, the Sentinelese and Andamans are in touch with oceanic currents, right? So they know that when an oceanic current is going to move past the Andamans, they kind of are on the beach foraging for materials that have drifted from as far as Bali and Indonesia. These kind of currents carry these built materials, and they then construct boats and stuff like that from these kind of much, much larger patterns. So it's kind of interesting that this conception of galactic time, or the idea of a 25,000-year cycle of when the Earth moves around the entire Milky Way, these kind of conceptions are still alive in oral tradition. There was this really interesting kind of speculation that, after the tsunami, that these beach-faring tribes would have been completely wiped out. But there is a memory of a tsunami in song, which said that when the ocean retreats, run into the forest, right? So this is these are Andaman Nicobarese songs, and as soon as the ocean retreated in the aftermath of the earthquake, this entire tribe had not a single casualty. They retreated deep into the forest, waited for the tsunami to come, the aftershocks, and then they came back and resumed, life as usual. So it's kind of interesting that a city-dwelling conception of time cannot have a racial memory of a tsunami, but in a galactic kind of sense, which is when organizations are existing at this scale, they have a very, very different expanded notion of time. Our paradigm kind of begins maybe 10,000 years ago with the Indus Valley civilization. The debate is still on whether the crops domesticated us or whether we domesticated the crops, but essentially crops created civilizations and cultures coming together to share stories, share hierarchies, and then human beings start getting ossified into pyramids, right? So I think this is a very familiar organization that all of us even look at in practice. The sort of concentration of power, resources, money, all kind of happens at the top of the pyramid, and you have a large kind of conception of a workforce or employees or, say, armies or politics. It kind of all follows this kind of paradigm, and I think most of us would be familiar with what comes next, right? So this is the manifestations of the pyramid in terms of how we visualize the accumulation of people. So the sort of agricultural age leads to the industrial age, where you have kind of large architects, big offices running in this kind of pyramidal fashion. On the image on the right is chicken, so in industrial farming. So it's kind of interesting to see the organization parallels. That's the Indian Army. So you have all these kind of large accumulations of people coming together and self-organizing in these kind of pyramids of power. And obviously, because it's a pyramid, value, hierarchies all flow towards the top. And then we obviously have the age of decentralization and postmodernism, which is something that's starting now. We can see these kind of trends starting in the 1960s. And this has fundamentally changed our conceptions of time. In the pyramidal kind of construct, you have notions of time that also flow from the top down. So essentially, someone at the top will tell you when it's lunchtime, or someone at the top will tell you when you can take a break and go home, or someone at the top will say, for example, install a clock tower and say that this is now the time that the city follows. So it's a kind of a hierarchical construct as well. In this kind of a conception, time flows parallelly, right? So you have the past and the future that kind of coexist in many ways, and you have multiple parallels of time moving. So I mean, what we are trying to explore as a practice today is this idea of living in a rhizomatic universe where things are interconnected. And the first step is actually to start thinking in networks, right? So if we had to sort of stop organizing our practices as flowcharts, but as organizing our practices and projects as webs, and then it allows you to start spotting interdependencies, what exists next to something else, right? So I think what's interesting is that in our practice, we've tried to create web-like organizations. We're part of now multiple collectives that are actually trying to do more interesting work than the more pyramidical structure of our own studio. So in Bandra, we're now part of a collective of 6 architecture offices that work in the public domain and trying to do more interesting work with the city. In Goa, we have something called the Goa Collective, which is kind of a sister organization, again, trying to do similar work with the city. And we're also in the process of setting up a city design lab in Panjim, which is kind of working with the mayor's office to look at how do we place trained urban designers and architects in the city machinery. So again, interestingly, right from sort of parks and promenades to organizing citizen festivals like the Ranvar festival that happens once a year, to kind of looking at augmented reality maps of old Goa. So the bottom image actually is a sister studio of ours, which is called Quicksand, which does photogrammetric sort of documentation. So within photogrammetry, you can actually pick up old artifacts, 3D scan them, and put them back into VR models of old churches and monuments. So this is, we actually had the opportunity to fly some drones in old Goa and extract wire meshes of old monuments. And then in VR, you can actually repatriate these monuments. So you can create you can say, listen to the choir singing in a monument that has been in ruin for 400 years through binaural audio. You can actually put altar pieces back that have been slowly siphoned off by the Goan grey market in antiques and bring those antiquities back and place them back into context, into situ, in a situation where you would never have seen that altar piece reconstructed. So these are the kind of projects that come out of these kind of really interesting, weird partnerships. We also look at converting architectural research and archival research into small collectibles and fundraising opportunities for activist groups. So when you are trying to raise money for a reconstruction, or when you're trying to raise money for people to re-engage with the old monument, you have these small shrines and small mementos that can be created using architectural record. So these are some of the things that we're trying to do through a more collaborative kind of framing. This is something we're very interested in. So this idea of Indo futurism, right? I think we don't realize how colonized we get by Hollywood retellings of what an Indian future could be like. When you watch a movie like Black Panther, it's this kind of really interesting extrapolation of what Afrofuturism is, right? And how could craft and how could these kind of interesting ideas be a part of how cities are conceived of. So I think obviously within India we have a very interesting mix of where we believe our futures are going. And we started this thing called the India Futures Project maybe around 6 or 7 years ago to kind of document vignettes of where Indian futures could be. Right? So you have, it started around the Statue of Unity, which is something which, just to share some specs with you, it's around 70,000 tons of cement went into the Statue of Unity, around 25,000 tons of steel, around 12,000 bronze panels, and around 3,000 crores of funding, right? So one is actually at some level not questioning the idea of building a statue. One is thinking about what else could this statue be, apart from being a symbol of ornamentation or politics, right? So we started thinking about other statues, like what would say if a statue had to conceal an e-waste mine in its basement. India is the number 5 largest producer of electronic waste in the world. So what if your statue could actually have the same amount of infrastructure and the same kind of spend, but it kind of rescues old PCBs, and the gold that's coming off the PCB can get flecked onto the statue as a real-time data visualization. So these are put out as provocations for the year 2035, saying that what else could a statue be apart from being a symbol of politics? Of course, after that, we started having some fun with it. So we did, maybe around 15, 20 statues we need. This is a Gandhi desalination plant, which could actually have massive desalination infrastructure. Most of our Indian cities are going dry. And in the next, I would say 10 to 15 years, we're going to be in a severely water scarce environment. So anywhere where we have a desalination plant that could be pushed into a 3,000 crore budget, it could be really, really interesting and as a problem solver almost. This is something that could be really cool for like a kind of a rejigged charkha, which could be a PM 2.5 scrubber at every single traffic intersection. So you could actually have Gandhi's charkha becoming recontextualized for the year 2035 and harvesting kind of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases at every single traffic intersection. And of course, also a nice photo op. This is actually when cities properly go dry, right? So we have water scarcity happening across the country. This is when we're going to be forced to use glacier melt that's coming off the Himalayas and pipe fresh snow and water into cities in the north of India. So sort of, installing these massive pipelines that are channeling glacier melt into cities for then kind of a stopgap consumption mechanism. That's a nudist colony in Ladakh, which kind of creates a thermal spa. So because, for example, we're going to slowly get more conscious of where our data is stored. Like, for example, today, all of our social media data is stored in some some nondescript location in California, right? But eventually, if there is a fire or there's some sort of natural outbreak, we're going to be very conscious of where our data is stored, right? So these are a few speculations around, kind of Ladakhi data servers, and obviously the thermal runoff from running so much supercomputing is then channeled into these kind of nudist colonies where people can go and take a nice hot water dip in a sort of a spa that's running on thermal runoff from a server farm. This is really cool. So there's this really interesting Oxfam report that in 2020 the number of billionaires in India was 102, and now we have 166 in 2022. Right? So you have a very different kind of billionaire that emerges in India, and the money normally comes from some really unconventional places. So we were kind of hypothesizing that you'll have these kind of citizen, space kind of excursions when Indian billionaires start emulating the Elon Musks of the world, saying that, okay, let us also go to space, right? But when you actually look at the kind of billionaires that we're going to be having, so you have, like, for example, a Gutka company like Kesari Galactic, which would essentially be looking at, channeling Gutka money into getting into space. Okay, so this is a fun one. We started thinking about how do you extract the amount of carbon that's required to decarbonize our cities, right? So what's happening is we mostly, in a design and architecture context, we have a sense of if we reduce or we recycle or we upcycle, right? These are ways in which we could be more sustainably minded. But I think if you look at emerging data, we realize that we're already past many planetary boundaries, right? We're already in a zone where we're past tipping points, essentially. So what now one actively needs to do is to create a new narrative around decarbonizing cities. And 4 billion tons of CO2 is a yearly target if we have to keep COP26 targets in mind. So how would our cities look if we had to decarbonize, actually, seriously? Right? So what are the kind of technologies that we will have to deploy, and what are the kind of stories that we need to start telling ourselves so we're ready to view our cities in the same way? And this is another tool we use very often in the studio called speculative fiction, which is an emerging discipline in design, where your images and products are used only for provoking dialogue. Right? Like they're not the sort of, the application is dubious, but the idea is that you use images as a provocation to start real conversations. So if, for example, one had to deploy this at the bottom of the pyramid, you will slowly have to extract CO2 across in a city-wide kind of a network. So corner buildings in old cities, congested cities, will have to be retrofitted with kind of carbon extraction mechanisms. The way to extract carbon is to now dissolve it into water. So you create a dilute carbon dioxide solution of carbonated water, and that is then possible to fix and use and transport. So if you had a very congested city, you could put in a massive radiator, and you have obviously infrastructure that has to be built to decarbonize these kind of congested city centers. Obviously, as it gets more and more refined, you'll have crafted things that fit into heritage monuments. You'll have interesting kind of extraction mechanisms happening everywhere. Once it hits the streets, you have sort of extraction trucks that would be patrolling, big highways, slowly extracting carbon dioxide at its source so it doesn't hit the atmosphere. What is interesting, what do you do with all this carbonated water, right? Like you'll have a massive reservoir of CO2 dissolved in water. The next step is you need to find an active volcano. So we have an active volcano in the Andamans called Barren Island. So all of this carbonated water will have to be shifted to Barren Island because you need molten basalt as the next step in our decarbonization. So this is a group of the first few scientists who've done a recce mission at Barren Island and have set up a small infrastructure on the island to kind of push carbonated water deep into the basalt. And what happens is, with this kind of industry, what you're doing is shifting the chemistry of basalt and making calcium carbonate, right? So you will slowly have massive caves of calcium carbonate, which are generated by shifting the chemistry of basalt. So you will have now a fixed, stable material that is creating a certain kind of experience deep in the caldera of the volcano. And over time, once you have a deployment of craftsmen and designers and architects, we will hopefully create underground cathedrals, underground architecture, underground expressions of this is the best of our civilization, this is what we can do, and working with sequestered carbon dioxide to create kind of underground experiences. Obviously, once you hit surplus, it's going to come to the surface. And we will have to now think of cities that are built with sequestered carbon dioxide. So it's a brittle material, so we will have to use it in a fairly brutalist way. We'll have to build dams and infrastructure, and our entire cities would start becoming white. And sort of, hopefully this also increases the albedo of the city, so you have more reflection, you have less dark concrete and more light limestone. So these are some of the sort of stories that one can start telling ourselves that this is how reality may actually work, because currently we've overshot planetary boundaries. We have also now in a paradigm where, because we've crossed these tipping points, big investment has to follow decarbonization. So it's not enough that we're going to, just slowly run out of. We're not going to stop taking flights. We're not going to stop, driving big SUVs. But big investment will have to now create cities that look like this. Whether this is utopian or dystopian, it's up to us as a group to kind of decide. But it's important to start thinking about these kind of paradigms and start visualizing through speculative fiction and through provocative ideas what our future cities could look like. This is again something that I think all of us are juggling with. I thought we'd just take a quick aside and talk a little bit about ideas of how AI and how other neurologies are actually going to aspect our workflows. So I think we start here. This is our own brain box. This is like a 7-pound, tissue layer with fat and somewhat of, a couple of billion neurons. This is really the seat of all our ego, our hubris, everything kind of comes from here, right? So what we've done over time is we have always relied on tools to extend our perception of our own neurologies outside our own brain boxes. So, I'd also urge you guys to think about what happens every time you pick up a paintbrush, right? Or even just driving a car, when you kind of go under a low bridge, what you do is you duck instinctively. That's because your brain has mapped your body extents to the extents of the car. So you've now imbibed the tool into your own neurology, right? So your body is now extending. You can see, okay, can I get past that auto rickshaw? Can I get past this guy? Because you have a sense of your own body limits, and now your brain has assimilated the car into it. So what's happening when you paint, right? Your brain is extending your finger by 6 inches, and it is allowing you to engage with wetness. It is allowing you to start seeing how much will this paint spread. And these are all neurological extensions of our own brain. So if you look at the other side of the spectrum, you have the electron microscope, where now you can for the first time see viruses. The human eye was never meant to see at that scale, but we have over time, using this big brain box in the middle, developed these kind of tools that we can extend our neurologies, right? But the next logical step is to start partnering with other neurologies, right? So you have, on the left, you have a CT scan of an elephant brain. The elephant brain has 3 times the number of neurons as the human brain. So by any metric, it's a lot more intelligent. Elephants can actually track 30 different other elephants when they're going and migrating across these large distances. They can track 30 different travel mates using their size of their brain. They have deep racial memory. They mourn their dead. So these are very, very intelligent species. These are alien intelligences that we know nothing about, right? We've not engaged with these neurologies. That's the bee brain, actually. Now, the bee brain is 0.0002% the size of a human brain, but the bee has a hive mind. right? So it's a conception of neurology that is a group neurology, and the bee can, just by waggling its butt, tell the other bees how far a source of nectar is and where's the right kind of nectar, how do we fly. It's timed, it's angled with the angle of the sun, so that the other members in the hive can actually find a direct path to go to this source of nectar. So it's very interesting that we have all these alien neurologies around us which we know nothing about, right? And if you start plotting these neurologies around our own brain, I mean, right from LSD to the Hubble telescope, these are all things that dissolve neurologies. These are all things that allow us to be a lot more collaborative with other neurologies around us. And I believe that AI is a first step, right? AI is a training ground for us. We're going to start learning how do we interact with another machine intelligence to be able to then learn the tools to start interacting with all the other neurologies that we're surrounded on Earth, right? And so this goes beyond 2035 in some sense, but if one had to say extrapolate to 2300 or say 3000, right? Where do we see our role as a species? So for example, imagine this guy, right? He's floating, above the Earth. He's looking at the planet below his feet. He has a sense of the fragility of the planet, right? You can see the atmosphere is one fingernail thick from space, right? And there's a sort of a documented cognitive shift that happens in astronauts. It's called the overview effect, which is when you leave the planet and you see the planet away from you, you have a sense of fragility. You have a sense of how fragile these ecosystems are. You don't see boundaries. You don't see differences in countries. You don't see differences in language. You see this beautiful blue marble, and you're kind of floating above this, and you have a completely different sense of place. You have a completely different cognitive makeup. And what this does is it takes us one step away from getting out of our own brain boxes, right? So this is a neurological experiment. This is a brain being rewired in space, right? And there's this really interesting Soviet cosmonaut, this guy called Kardashev, who came up with this planetary scale. And what he says is that a type 1 civilization is the civilization that can harness all the power of its own planet. Right? So just to give you a sense of context, the amount of sunlight that strikes the Earth every hour is enough to power the whole of humanity for 1 year. Right? But it's just that we don't have the technology or the neural makeup to be able to harness this power, right? So that's why we are burning fossil fuels, and that's why we are in this kind of regressive paradigm, because we just don't have the tools, we don't have the neurology, because we've constrained ourselves with our own brain boxes. We refuse to learn from machine intelligence, we refuse to learn from bees, or we refuse to learn from elephants. And this is maybe a track that we will have to go through, to kind of hit the rock bottom and then slowly start rebuilding our neurologies to be kind of more inclusive and sort of start behaving like a planetary brain. Right? Like, how can you actually learn from the intelligence of a mushroom, or how can you learn from the intelligence of a forest, and start applying those things to our own neurologies to build the technologies that we will tend to become a type 1 civilization. And obviously the scale goes into type 3, which is a civilization that is able to harness the power of its entire galaxy. Right? So that's when we become an intergalactic species. So I think this is, anyway, it goes off the deep end, but the idea is kind of saying that if one had to extrapolate from today, what are the kind of inhibitions that we have within our own brains, and what do we need to get out of? And I feel that partnering with AI and creating a more symbiotic relationship rather than a pushback, saying that, okay, these are not tools that I need. This is, going to hurt my conception of pyramid. I think if we move out of the pyramidical conception of time and we move closer to a rhizomatic conception of time, where all these are parallel and all these are adjacent, it makes us a lot more inclusive as a civilization. I'd just like to end my chat over here is this idea of intergenerational kindness, right? So what could we do today that would make us better ancestors, right? So for example, there's this lovely story. This is the New College in Oxford. So obviously the New College is not new. It is 800 years old. And on the ceiling of their great hall, they have these oak wood beams. And the oak wood beam is approximately 2 feet by 2 feet by 40 feet long, right? So it's a single piece of wood. And I think around 100 years ago, there was this really inquisitive entomologist who kind of was walking around on the beams of the college, and he noticed a beetle infestation. So he started seeing that all these oak wood beams had now had fully corroded from inside, and they were almost to a point of collapse. And he raised this concern to the school council, and the school council was like, oh man, now what do we do? We have, where do we get these beams from? And they panicked and they started looking around at all the lands that Oxford owns to find out, do we have any of these kind of oak trees? And so after almost 8 or 9 years, they recalled the Oxford forester. So Oxford has a forester who's on the panel. And they called him back to campus and said, okay, we have this problem, we have these kind of beams. So he's like, we were wondering when you'd ask. And it seems that when the beams were laid into the college, into the architecture, there was a grove of 40 oak trees that was planted at the same time. Because they know that in the end, beams get beetly. And they know that we're going to need this material for the future. So they had planted something 500 years ago that would have been now useful when the beams actually corrode. So I think what's really interesting here is to extrapolate a grammar of intergenerational kindness, right? What could we do today that will make us better ancestors? What are the forests that we need to plant today to be able to be harvested by our generations or our kids or our grandchildren? So just to give you an example closer to home, in Goa, where I live now, there is this lovely old, it's called the Ponte de Nilares. It's a sort of an old bridge that was built by the Jesuits. And it was built by using the wood of this tree called the Zambo tree. So it's a local ironwood, right? And what happens is with ironwood is when you immerse it in water, it works a bit like a wooden pile. So you have Venice, for example, which also floats on a foundation of ironwood trees. Today, we need to plant those ironwood trees because there is a point where carbon will become such a problem and flooding will become such a problem that we will not be able to pour concrete into foundations anymore, and we will need these ironwood trees. So this is actually a call for us today to start planting these ironwood forests and say, let's be prepared for when this happens in the next 50, 60 years, right? So thank you so much.